Okay, hopefully the slides may come off, but yeah, they're mainly here so that I can remember what to say today. It's a great honor to be here today, and I have to thank colleagues at SANEM and Salim Raihan for inviting me here today. I think as Salim hinted at the beginning, I'm not an economist. I originally trained as an economic geographer and have wandered across the disciplines, but I've learned a lot from economists over the time, and sometimes also looked at them rather strangely and thought, how can you believe the world is, you know, can be assumed to be as simple as your model is telling me? So I've learned a lot, and also at times been horrified at what economists do. I mean, before I move off into talking about climate change, I have to just say how great I think SANEM is. The dynamism here, the whole focus that it's got in other parts of the world where the University of Manchester's got partnerships, then the hand of donors or external financiers seems to be very important. This sort of dynamic development of an intelligentsia, it's the sort of thing we come across in Latin America. It's really great to feel people coming together because they want to create knowledge, they really want to understand things, and they want to generate their own ideas about how to make this world a better place. So it's a real privilege to be with SANEM. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is the findings of a book, not an academic book, it's an advocacy book based on research that Manoj Roy and I have been doing, looking at the way in which people in Dhaka and Chittagong in the Busties are adapting to the environmental changes associated with climate change. But we decided that we'd move into an advocacy text to try and take some of those findings back to the West, back to the UK and Europe and the USA, to help people understand that climate change was not something which would be solved by gifts from rich nations to poor nations, from rich people to poor people, but that climate change was something that was already being dealt with in parts of the world that are not seen as privileged, being dealt with by poorer people with more limited resources. And we produced this book, Bangladesh Confronts Climate Change, Keeping Our Heads Above Water. Hopefully it's going open access soon, and you might get access to it, but its real audience is actually targeted for the people who are creating the problem, which tend to be in the richer countries and tend to be the 10% of the world who are using carbon rather profligately. You might look at me with that, and I will try to, well, we can see whether I can explain my own position on it. I've also taken a few slides from my colleague Kevin Anderson, who works at the Tyndall Centre on Climate Change in Manchester. He's a climate change modeller. And just so we know where we are, somebody has been appointed to the Environmental Protection Agency in the USA this morning who thinks that climate change may not be occurring, and that. But this is what the figures look like. If you look at the carbon dioxide emissions that humanity has put into the atmosphere since 1750, this is looking at gigatons, that's 1,000 billion tons of carbon dioxide, then the figure is this graph which just goes up and up and up, associated with modernization and industrialization and the rise in living standards in many parts of the world. And despite the talk that we have of capping and peaking, you can see it's still going up very sharply. Each year at the moment, we emit more and more carbon dioxide. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change predicts that climate change will have many effects, and if you look at Bangladesh, then it argues that these are going to be pretty hard, that environmental problems will intensify in Bangladesh. 4 particular ways. The cyclones will be stronger. The present modelling says they won't be more frequent, as was thought maybe early on they might be, but it will be that they will be stronger. The winds will be fiercer, the surges will be higher. One of the alarming things I'm told by engineers at Buet is that many of the buildings in Dhaka that have been built to standards to resist high power winds, the winds now are predicted to get stronger than the levels to which they were built at. And most of the buildings obviously in Dhaka have not been built to that strength. We hear that there'll be increased and more intense rainfall, particularly episodes of rainfall that will be very heavy, increased river flooding, and sea level rise will occur. So there's a whole set of things that will make Bangladesh more difficult to live in. Can the country cope? Well, depends on what you mean by cope. It depends on how you model and look at these things. In the book, we argue that certainly up until the mid-21st century, Bangladesh can cope, but there are going to be high costs. High costs as the costs of adapting to these environmental changes rises. If we were to achieve a capping of 1.5 degrees Celsius in global warming, the cap that Bangladesh has been very effectively encouraging other countries to think about, then we argue Bangladesh could cope, but there would need to be substantial investments and there would be substantial costs. But if we move to 2 degrees Celsius, which is what Paris is really talking about at the moment, then climate change and the effects of climate change peak around about 2100. There would be much higher costs. Perhaps Bangladesh could cope. But when you actually look at what was promised at Paris and what the present predictions are, then we're looking at a world which will certainly increase its temperature by 2.7 degrees Celsius, but perhaps 3 degrees Celsius or 4 degrees Celsius if we don't slow down in the next 10 to 20 years with the emissions that we have. And that would be very different. Significant parts of Bangladesh might disappear, but I think as my friend Kevin Anderson at Manchester, and I say he's a climate change model, and as he puts it, the world would just be a very different place. Wet parts of the world would be dry. Dry parts of the world would be wet. Parts of the world that are quite warm would be very warm. Parts of the world that are quite cold might be very cold. We would have tremendous changes. The climate variability would be very severe if we move up to that. Now, a key point that we make in the book is that Bangladesh has not just been sitting down watching these environmental changes, and that its scientists have been looking at them. 1990 was when we began to get the first report on climate change coming out of the nascent intergovernment panels. That's also when we get BCAS and Salim ul-Haq and Atiq Rahman and others publishing the first books about what climate change will do in Bangladesh. So there's been 30 years of science already in Bangladesh looking at these things. It's not Bangladesh catching up with scientists. And certainly most Bangladeshi scientists and many Bangladeshi people know what is coming. There's going to be continuing international negotiations to reduce carbon emissions. But the key thing to note about those, and I'll talk about this in a bit more detail in a second, is the agreements so far are not enough. Paris, in a way, was a great success because it didn't fail. But it wasn't a success because it moved things forward. It's simply that it wasn't Copenhagen revisited. And so Paris is actually the bottom of the steps, and we have to start going up this ladder much more quickly. It's simply given us the ladder. It's not that we're actually getting up the ladder at the moment. And then the second thing is actually there is going to have to be more adaptation. As the environment changes, then one has to change. Bangladesh certainly is, by all of the modelling that's done, all of the science that's been done, one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to climate change, and certainly it's where you've got a very large population, many, a significant number of whom are very vulnerable to changes from climate change, but it's not a helpless victim. Now, I think I'm preaching to the converted here because you know the processes here, you know what's happening, but certainly in Europe and in the USA, there is this image of Bangladesh that comes from the 1970s about its economic and social and human development status. But there's also a feeling with climate change that somehow that's what's happening, that Bangladesh is sort of helplessly vulnerable to these waves and winds that are coming in, and that needs to be an outsider coming in to give the country the money and the science so that it can begin to cope with these things. And certainly, if you look at the evidence that we present in the book, then no, Bangladesh is actually a key actor in these processes at international levels and also at local levels in terms of what communities and engineers are trying to do. If one looks internationally, then Bangladesh has taken a real lead in getting the least developed countries group at the United Nations, the 48 countries in that group, in helping to shape the global negotiations. And Bangladesh played a key part of the role in getting 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming fitted into the Paris Agreement. The rich nations of the world are very happy to stick with 2 degrees Celsius, but because of the efforts of a whole number of least developed countries and climate vulnerable countries, then Paris for the first time allowed the idea of a lower target that would cause much less damage to be inserted in the agreement. And that is progress, but it's only getting it onto paper. Getting it into action will take a lot more effort. Bangladeshi representative of the government and scientists have also played a key part in bringing together a group of countries called the Climate Vulnerable Forum, the least developed countries of the UN, the African Union and the small island states, in getting them to come together at the United Nations, at the conferences about climate change, and getting them to present their position about the incredible costs that they are going to be imposed on them if climate change is not tackled. They've also helped Bangladeshi negotiators to bring together the V20, the most vulnerable 20 countries in the world, to get their ministers of finance to meet regularly to talk about how they're fitting the costs of climate change into their budgets and whether the international financial system is helping them with that. So there is a great deal of action at the international level in Bangladesh, but there's also been action by Bangladeshi scientists and engineers to look at what's happening in the country and work out how to deal with it. But Bangladesh, of course, is often seen as a country which faces severe environmental challenges, but Bangladeshis have been coping with these challenges for hundreds of years, for millennia. So adapting to environmental problems is something which actually is built into the agroecological systems and the ways in which Bangladeshi people and scientists have had to operate. It's the slide I use sort of with audiences in Europe and the USA to help them understand very simply what the costs of climate change might be. Here we see a lady in a flooded area paddling in her canoe to go and get fresh water. The image that I use to help people understand this is if you look at the house, it's been raised, and it's raised above the floods. So there's been an adaptation there, paid for by this household, which means that they are avoiding, at the moment, rising levels of flood. If you look at the water pump that's right in the front, it can't be used, which is why she's having to paddle off to find a water pump from which she can get water. And if you think about what this household will need to do, it will need to raise that water pump so that when deeper floods come in the future, it can get clean water beside its house, and that will cost $100, perhaps $200. Who should pay for that? Should it be this lady, or should those who are helping the water to rise, those who are using carbon most intensively and emitting most intensively, should they be taking on the costs for it being necessary to raise that water pump? Now, when we think specifically about Bangladesh and we move from the international role to what's happening here, then obviously the key thing is that Bangladesh is essentially a living delta. It's a country that maps itself onto an extremely dynamic physical environment, a delta. That delta is associated with vast amounts of water that come down from the monsoons during the monsoon season and coming down from the Himalayas, but it's also the recipient of round about 1 billion tons of sediment a year. The Himalayas are being eroded, and as they're eroded, then much of the sediment is brought down to the delta. And that's why we have a very dense population in Bangladesh, because this renewal of the soils has permitted very productive forms of agriculture and has made it an attractive base for settled agriculture. But those floods do bring significant problems, particularly erosion, and erosion around riverbanks means that people lose their farms, that sometimes government and towns disappear and the government offices disappear. But we do get new islands forming in parts of the Chors and out in the Bay of Bengal. This is also associated with catastrophic floods, say roughly once every decade, when much of the country is flooded and when economic life is slowed down dramatically. And then we've also got the annual cyclones, which every 10 to 15 years can be extremely severe. We've also got the fact that 1/3 of the country is below 3 meters in sea level, so that relatively small rises in sea level or increases in the surge of waves coming in from the Bay of Bengal can have fairly dramatic effects. The country, and I suppose as is known in the country, has moved from this idea of a basket case to a development success. Still in the West, the phrase that was used, not by Kissinger, we're told, but by one of Kissinger's aides, that Bangladesh would be a permanent basket case, that still tends to remain. And I remain quite amazed in the UK when I tell people that I work in Bangladesh. They assume this is a country that is roughly the same way as it was in the 1970s, and they don't realize there's been an economic and social transformation. The country now feeds itself. It's got better health standards than India. As Amartya Sen and John Dresov pointed out, fertility rate coming down to 2.2, 2.3 births per woman, and an amazing demographic transition has taken place. And certainly economic growth has been able to promote human development. We've had the demographic dividend and we've got human development. But there's also underlying forces, which I think Hossein Zila Rahman has been writing about and talking about a lot recently, just of the amount of innovation that is occurring in Bangladesh, the adaptation, the research, sometimes high-level scientific research, but often lower-level technological advances that have occurred. And if one looks at this, one can certainly look at the way that Borrow rice was developed in Bangladesh and went around the country so quickly. Microfinance, these institutions of microfinance, which I think Siddiqa Osmani and I disagree about some of the impacts on, but certainly one of the things that one can see there is that's created hundreds of thousands of jobs for lower middle class people across the country. It's really contributed to economic growth processes, solar panels and a set of other things. And so certainly there are dynamics here which appear to be indigenous, not simply taking on what's happening in the outside world. One of the real success stories that one can point to, and that certainly I've been able to talk in the USA about this, that people weren't understanding, was that Bangladesh has largely been responsible on its own grounds for reducing cyclone deaths by 99%. That the super cyclone of 1970 left 500,000 dead, and that was the sort of figure that might have been expected. By 1991, that's going down significantly, and that most recently, when we look at 2007, then it's more than 3,000 dead. That's a terrible thing to happen, but cyclones that did used to cause hundreds of thousands of deaths can now be expected to only cause thousands of deaths. That's because of shelters, because of effective early warning systems, the meteorological system working much better, the forms of information transmission that have been set up, and having 50,000 volunteers able to go out and tell people about it. And certainly the cyclone shelters have been a key element of this. Very effective. They have many problems, such as access to them, such as the position of women in them and what happens, whether women can get access and whether they're treated well in them. Substantial problems, but those cyclone shelters have certainly helped, and it certainly looks with these predictions about climate change as though a lot more cyclone shelters are going to be needed, and they're going to have to be constructed to much higher standards because they're going to have to cope with higher powers of winds and higher surges. The cities, work Manoj Roy and I have done with other colleagues at Brack University, Ferdas Jehanan and others on this, are a real concern, because quite how, particularly the mega cities of Dhaka and Chittagong, how they will adapt to climate change, and particularly for the poorer people in those cities, is not clearer. More than 40% of the populations are living in low-income settlements in the cities. How increasing environmental problems due to climate change will affect their living standards and also their livelihoods is not well understood. How flooding, increased cyclone damage and disrupted livelihoods will be managed is not at all clear on that. And certainly when one looks at Bangladesh's climate change strategy and action plan, which it's been argued certainly is is a document that takes things forward. It's been used in many other countries to say this is the sort of planning that you should be doing about climate change. That identifies 20 priority actions, but none of those actions are about how to support or assist people who live in low-income settlements and busties in Dhaka or Chittagong, and we need to get the urban environment incorporated into the climate change strategy and action plan. One of the ways, certainly, in which Bangladeshi scientists are looking at helping to move things forward is by looking at the feasibility of raising the land more quickly than land will be flooded as sea rises. And certainly, if one looks at the history of water and land management in Bangladesh, then there's evidence that over the centuries, systems of tidal river management have allowed the trapping of sediment when in the dry season the tides move inland, and if the water is managed effectively, it's possible to raise the land by capturing the sediment. The dikes and polders that were built often with USAID funding and funding from Europe in the late colonial period, but later on in the period immediately after independence, have not proved particularly effective. This is a repaired patch where a cyclone had breached one of the polders, but the use of, in a way, of technology and science based upon what happens in Holland and what we do with the Rhine in Europe has not transferred effectively to Bangladesh. The transfer of that Western engineering expertise did not work well in the 60s, 70s and 80s, and so we do need to be thinking about systems perhaps building upon both historical knowledge in Bangladesh and the work of Bangladeshi scientists at Buet to see how we could use tidal river management to raise the land. If that can be achieved and if that is done, then it will mean that new dams and polders will have to be built. Every 30 years, it will probably be necessary to flood many areas with saline land to let the sediment come in during the dry season, and there will be substantial engineering costs and substantial livelihood costs for farmers whose land is tilled saline for 3 or 4 years afterwards. And we certainly have to think about who should pay for that. Should it be Bangladesh, or should it be those who are using carbon in ways that are changing the climate? The country is already spending round about $1 billion a year, it's estimated, on adapting to climate change. 3/4 of that is from domestic funds, round about the other quarter coming from the World Bank, often as loans. And so a key question that I'm putting to audiences in Europe and the USA is who should pay for the stronger cyclone shelters, for the research that we need, for constructing the new polders and raising the land. The obvious answer is the countries who've caused global warming. They've been very good at the moment at making promises, but they haven't really delivered on those promises to Bangladesh or to other countries yet. Gordon Brown, I think with his heart very much in the right place, pledged in 2008 £75 million immediately to help adaptation to climate change in Bangladesh, and that another 75 million would follow within a few years. By 2016, the negotiations had been so complicated that only £61 million had been dispersed, and actually the government of Bangladesh had to refund £14 million of the original 75 million to the UK because it was impossible to agree on how that would be used and how it would be accounted for. And much of the problem with this was associated with the setting up of the multi-donor trust fund managed by the World Bank, and arguments about the high fees that would lead to, and whether this would mean that climate change in Bangladesh began to be directed by external financiers, and that the role of Bangladeshi democratic processes, the Bangladeshi government and Bangladeshi scientists would be marginalized if the funding was to be channeled through an external agency in that way. Perhaps the Green Climate Fund, which has already managed to disburse 40 million, there may be modalities forward, but whether we can be optimistic at that at the moment with some of the changes that are occurring through democracy in the USA, we'd have to think about. And I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes, and it needs to be a couple of minutes because I'm going to be closed down, on mitigation, nets and equity. This is the work that other colleagues at Manchester are doing. particularly colleague Kevin Anderson, and there's some references I'll give you at the end. What they argue is that serious mitigation has to start today, that the talking has to finish, and we have to start mitigating rich nations, and particularly rich country. They argue that these targets in terms of temperature are not sufficient. We need to start looking at carbon budgets of the globe, of countries, of individuals, and thinking about how we reduce carbon budgets. And they argue that assuming that technology will fix the problem in the future, that negative emission technologies, that biomass and carbon capture and storage technologies will suck carbon out of the atmosphere, is something on which economists have been doing quite a lot of work, but something that we cannot yet depend on. And they also point to the inequity of what's happening. I was just going to fit a bit of economics in. This is what my colleague Kevin Anderson says. Economics, how have we climate scientists arrived at this compliant status to avoid exceeding the maximum rate of emission reduction dictated by economists? Impossibly early peaks in emissions are assumed, together with naive notions about big engineering and low carbon infrastructure. And Kevin is very critical of economists, and he says that economists are scientists, but their close links to policymakers means that the assumptions that they make about the speed at which technology will be created, that will be able to suck carbon out of the air, are not matched by what the actual mechanical engineers and scientists know about these processes. And so he argues that economists need to be extremely careful about their links with policy and are not led into making assumptions which are really highly unlikely to occur. Let's quickly look at that. This is what Paris is promising us. This is certainly what the University of Manchester models at the moment show will happen. We're not slowing down, we're not dipping down at the rate that has been suggested so that we peak things in 2025 in some way, and it looks as though we're going to exceed that. That means that an extra 10 to 20 gigatons go into the atmosphere each year. If we do that and we're to achieve eventually no emissions by 2050, then it means rather than going down a very steep hill to reduce our carbon emissions, we've got to fall off a cliff round about 2030, in about 10 years' time. We've got to suddenly drop our carbon emissions at what certainly our mechanical engineers and technologists at Manchester find is not likely to happen. So how does this fit the euphoria about Paris? Well, it's basically by pulling the rabbit out of the magician's hat. Talking about negative emissions technologies, talking about biomass energy with carbon capture and that. And basically what this is saying, the BECS, is that we can grow trees and grasses, we can harvest them, we can then burn them to create power, but we can capture the carbon as it's leaving the chimney, almost liquefy it, and then we pump it underground to where we've got oil in the past, to where we've been fracking and other places. It's essentially like the oil industry in reverse. We actually turn the carbon dioxide into oil and pump it back underground. We sort of put the oil that we've been taking out for the last 120 years back in the ground. This has never been done at scale. It's done in laboratories. It's never been done at scale at the moment. And yet the economic models assume that in 10 to 15 years, it will be operating very effectively. It requires planting the area of India each year, perhaps 2 or 3 Indias, with trees or with fast-growing grasses. So it requires phenomenal changes in agricultural and ecological systems if one is going to do that. And so we really have to think about whether these mitigation scenarios are serious, and we need to move more quickly. The final point then is about equity, and this is that 50% of global carbon emissions come from 10% of the population. If the top 10% of global emitters simply reduced their emissions to the EU average, then we'd reduce global emissions by 1/3. So we could do that very quickly. Who is that group? Well, scientists traveling around the world, policymakers, business leaders and businessmen, those who are frequent flyers, I better not say this, and academics and researchers. They are parts of this group and they need to be thinking about getting serious. We've only got maybe a little bit serious at the University of Manchester with our Global Development Institute, but we're trying to have 50% of our international meetings virtually. We are trying to use Skype a lot more, and we're doing that. My colleague Kevin Anderson, who I've taken these slides from, does take things seriously. He no longer flies. He only uses the train. He takes the train occasionally to Beijing, more often into to Europe. He's given up his car. He actually gave up his fridge 10 years ago. And he says it is possible to construct this life in the UK, but we need to really be thinking about these things. So the final points then certainly are that the 2 points coming out of this image of Bangladesh as a helpless victim, we really need to challenge that in the rich world, but we need to be asking who pays, and at the moment those payment modalities are not there, but we also need to be thinking about whether that top 10%, which includes many of us, need to start setting a model so that we try to move towards much less carbon profligate lifestyles. Thank you very much, and there are some readings there if you want them.